And I have three eminent panelists with me. Maybe I'll just invite them on stage. Mr. Sudhakar Desai, the CEO of Emami and also the president of IVPA. Mr. Sanjeev Asthana, who's the CEO of Patanjali Foods. And yes, sir, please. Yes. Yes, yes. And Mr. Jagjeet, who's the country director for India. So I was going to do a kind of, kind of context setting with some slides, but since we are running out of time, maybe I'll quickly go through some. Can we have the slides? So the whole session is about sustainable palm oil, or rather sustainability in the vegetable oil sector, and particularly we'll focus on the palm industry. But I'm sure we have such eminent panelists. I'm sure they can deliberate on and share their thoughts on other oilseed sector as well. But we'll try to stick to palm as much as possible. Palm oil. Just wanted to show this image. Palm oil has gotten a lot of bad press over the years, and there are reasons to it because the growth of the industry, particularly in Southeast Asia, has resulted in a lot of environmental and social. If we can request the audience to please settle down. Yeah. So palm oil over the years has contributed to a lot of environmental destruction, particularly in Southeast Asia. A lot of rainforests have been converted into oil palm plantations. So the primary driver or the focus on the palm industry over the years has only been on deforestation. Anything around palm has been associated with deforestation. However, with changing times, with more awareness and transparency on the deforestation issues, now the sector is also coming to understand that there are also labor issues, there are human rights, there are a lot of social elements that are in the sector, there are issues within the sector that needs to be addressed. So it's no longer just about deforestation when you talk about sustainability in palm, but it is much, much more broader and both environmental and social. So these are just some headlines. So when you look at the newspapers, when you search palm, most of what you will see is really, really bad information that palm oil is bad. There's been a lot of issues around palm. That is what you generally hear about palm. But why are we so dependent on palm? Palm is one of the most highest yielding crops. So these numbers give you, so for 1 metric ton of palm oil, you just need 0.26 hectares, whereas when you compare it to soybean, it's almost 2 hectares is what you need. So palm oil is one of the highest yielding crops, oil seeds, and it helps in improving farmer livelihoods. And we've seen that transformation in most of Malaysia and Indonesia, and now we are seeing that transformation also in Africa and Latin America, which are increasingly adapting to oil palm as a means for economic development. So palm is one of the most versatile crops, but also the most, the highest yielding crops. And the overall vegetable oil sector is expected to grow to 305 million metric tons by 2050. So there's a lot of demand coming in from the oil sector, and palm could be a good solution for us because it uses less land and produces more oil. So briefly about RSPO, my organization, we are a multi-stakeholder organization. We work with the entire supply chain, but we also work with the non-supply chain actors such as in financial institutions, the NGOs, farmer groups, everybody to have a dialogue and conversation around sustainability and how we can transform the entire sector to work towards more sustainable production. We have about over 5,500 members globally, and of the approximately around 70 million tons of palm oil that is produced globally, approximately around 15 million tons is already certified according to the RSPO standards currently. And a lot of it is bought by the market. So what does it mean for India? So we are one of the largest importers, or we are the largest importers of oil palm. It ranges anywhere between 8 to 9 million tons, give or take a few. And in 2021, it was about 9.3 million tons. Percent of what we import actually ends up in the food sector. A lot of it goes into through our ration shops and others, public distribution system. A small volume enters personal care, your soaps, shampoos, detergents, all of that. So we've been a largely import-dependent, and we still a largely import-dependent country for vegetable oils. And palm is the biggest part of your vegetable oil imports that we have been importing over the years. We're dependent, and we depend on it for food security. So in order to move away from the import dependency and to make ourselves a bit more self-reliant and Atmanirbhar, the government launched the NMEOP, the National Mission on Edible Oils, Oil Palm Scheme. a couple of years back in 2021, with when the government had policy has identified around 14 states, both in the northeast, in the south of India, to incentivize and produce oil palm. And the targeted reach for the potential area that has been identified is almost 27.99 lakh hectares in the coming years. Whereas the state of Telangana has been in the forefront in terms of oil palm production. We heard this morning from the minister as well as the secretaries on how active the oil palm sector and the growth in this particular sector is. And the Telangana Oil Palm Mission, this is a slide data from them. They're expecting almost 20, the target is about 20 lakh acres in 3 years and approximately 4 million metric tons of palm oil. If we manage to achieve these targets, I think we will be one of just the Telangana state will be one of the largest palm producing states in the regions in the world. Or third or fourth largest probably in the world. So that's the potential that we have. So I'll pause there. So I wanted to open it with the general context of what we are discussing about. It's really largely about oil palm sector and the issues that we have seen and what I mentioned, the environmental issues, the social issues, and the negative perception around palm that we've encountered over the years is largely stems from the experience in Southeast Asia. Whereas India, we are in a position, we are just getting into oil palm cultivation. And we have a clean slate, rather, and a lot of our conversion is from agricultural land, that is from other crops, particularly rice paddy, that's going into oil palm. So there is a different story that's happening in India compared to experience in Southeast Asia. So we'd like to hear from the panelists on their thoughts on these aspects, but I would also request them to sort of reflect on both our potential, our influence in the global market as the largest importer, because we importer. We are the largest trading partner for most of the oil palm producing countries, and those countries have a lot of issues in terms of sustainability. And sustainability, as was said in the previous panel, is not restricted to one country, or it's not a responsibility of one actor, nor a responsibility of one country. It's a collective responsibility. So I'll open the discussion with a question, just an open question to all our panelists, to share their thoughts on the sustainability of the vegetable oil sector in general, both in terms of our role as a trading partner, as well as a country that's about to get into oil palm production in India. Any challenges, opportunities, what you've seen in terms of sustainability in the sector? So perhaps I'll start with Mr. Desai, if you could.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you. Hello. Yeah. I think it's a small cream of the group, and we are getting more popular because there's no chairs for everybody to sit in, I think. So with that good note, with my friends here, very good start. The fact that sustainability is the first panel itself shows, how important this topic has been. I would like to cover only 3 aspects, because there are only 4 numbers in the world. 1, 2, 3, and many. Okay, so only 3 points will make sense. Number 1, I think Indian agriculture is a miracle by itself. We just heard that despite lack of all the talks that we've been talking over last 1 decade, and looking at the next forward 10 years, I think one thing is that this myth that the Indian farmer is only 2.5 hectares, there's nothing that he can do. You always have that picture in mind. But then how is this miracle happening? Is that about 20.5 or 21 million farmers are holding over 50% of the land. So by any definition, they're as good as medium to big farmers. I think it is that yield, that production that is contributing to the whole agricultural production. No wonder after feeding 1.4 billions, we still have surpluses of wheat, we have surplus of milk, as we just heard, we can produce for the world. So with all the sustainable practices and ability to handle the environment, there are 3 dimensions like social, environmental, and economical. With all these things, India can be definitely football in a sustainable manner to the world. Coming back to edible oil sector, I think the biggest need, the second point is, it's a beautiful opportunity for India to import substitute. Being the largest importer of in the world, is not a problem. It is also an opportunity to produce more and more in a sustainable manner. And import substitute, we have a ready demand. And any marginal change at the farm level in terms of yields, and also any marginal change in terms of demand, you can see, how humongous the size of the business would become. Last time I spoke about oilseed sector trying to project. In the last two events, I was trying to construct this into the next 10 years, like 2030. Even if we achieve 50% of self-sufficiency, one of which is definitely oil palm mission, by low-hanging fruits like, you have mustard, you have sunflower oil, you have groundnut. It's a miracle that we can do in edible oil sector with right approach. What are we missing? What are the main problems here? Number one comes to my mind as the profitability. I think I would call it leveraging the policy issues to create a roadmap for a profitable oilseed production. Because just because India is abundant in certain products doesn't necessarily mean farm incomes are going that much. See, don't forget the fact that farm income is still on average at $2,000 per annum. And half of the farm dependent people are earning only $3 a day. So there is a huge scope in terms of demand growth in the rural sector itself. So this is a great opportunity. And also with the changes in the environmental factors right now, the fragile model, which is so rain-fed dependent, especially in the oilseed sector, is another opportunity where we need to make it more sustainable in terms of irrigation facilities and de-link from the vagaries of monsoon in the sector. Third and most important thing is use of technology in all aspects of it. Probably for this weather, the scientists, we have Dr. Arvind Prasad here, we have whole community here of scientists working towards such a thing. I think we need to develop high-yielding, almost weather-resistant, climate-smart agriculture to make the oilseed mission happen, or towards sustainability to happen. So that's what I would say for now. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sudhakarji. Maybe then I'll switch to Mr. Sanjeev Asthana to share your initial thoughts on sustainability.
So let me pick it up from what is really happening to Southeast Asia first, quickly, and why this is increasingly will become important for India. And maybe, some of the faith which Sudhakar has on India's self-sufficiency increasing by 50%, why it is probably, hoping against hope, or it's just a dream right now. So in terms of the way the whole consumer movement is happening, and for various reasons, genuine concerns about climate and the growing practices, there is a lot of regulations which are coming in, especially, for example, in Europe, on palm oil that's originating in Indonesia, from Indonesia and Malaysia. That the peat land which has been brought, under cultivation, under oil palm, the practices, what they followed, and there's a clear regulation that by 24, 25, some bit of restrictions will start coming in. The reason could be different. I mean, it could genuinely be to support, the domestic industry. It could be consumer movement or being sensitive to the consumer concerns. It could be either of all these factors could play a role. But the fact is that the risk, at a very, very national level, at a policy level, of if you're not seen as somebody who's a responsible producer, as a responsible company, or a responsible supply chain player, these are concerns which will increasingly become more acute as we go forward. And Indonesia's action on going towards D30 to D35 to even talk of D40, I think is going to be one part which will play a major role as we go forward. The second issue which is happening in agriculture sector at large, one of the reasons why India's dairy sector is expanding so rapidly is that this whole sort of methane emission, by the animals, in, especially in the cattle in Europe, they're increasingly reducing their production of milk, and moving it to countries like India. And I'm anticipating that at some point of time, over the next decade or so, the milk production in Europe will substantially decline. And most of it would start sort of happening from India on account of the practices that we have. But more importantly is that, they feel that India is not yet so sort of mindful of environmental concerns. Farmers need more of dairy to sort of, to happen. It's enhancing income. So a lot of it is moving towards that part. To summarize this part is that I think the issue broadly is that concerns on environment, concerns on around the practices that we follow, India will have to deal with the whole politics around sustainability, environment, climate change issues, which are going to have increasing concerns in the years to come. And the policy side has to be very much seized of that. And that requires a much deeper insight into really what is happening at the ground level rather than at a very superficial level, those discussions. And we still need to go down that path to really work things out as to why, whether regulation side or policy side is occurring, for what reason. So that's first part of my question. To the second issue in terms of edible oils specifically, you do know that, there's been a large scale sort of deforestation, and especially in countries like Indonesia. Now we're seeing that in Nigeria, oil palm, which is growing Papua New Guinea. So obviously, but Indian agriculture on the palm oil side specifically is very different. So we don't have any land, for example. So our ability to bring in sort of deforestation is banned in the country for almost last 2 decades now. So there's no question of getting in any forest land into the oil palm cultivation. So most of the land, and we had played a very active role, both at a company level and sort of at an individual level, sort of when the policy was getting formed with the central government, that IIOPR had identified about 1.3 million hectares of land which could potentially be brought under cultivation, of which the government granted 650,000 hectares. They said we could do it under this policy, NMEOP, and of which they distributed that into the respective states, which are the most ideal states are Andhra, Telangana, parts of Karnataka. Of course, they have taken other states. And the big chunk of that is Northeast, where we are also doing it in a large way, both Arunachal, Assam, Mizoram, Tripura and Nagaland in a small way. Andhra is largely getting towards a point of saturation, so big scope is really coming in Telangana and Karnataka. So where these concerns are getting raised, both at a broader level, it's unlikely that, this will have any major impact. And unlike the palm oil cultivation that we see in the Southeast Asia, ours is entirely, irrigated and micro-irrigation. So in fact, if you were to look at the efficiency of water usage in oil palm cultivation in India, it's amongst the most efficient ways of using water when we grow the oil palm. The palm oil production is done. And if in the fullness of time, so today it's we already have about 250,000 hectares under plantation, of which the active plantation, we ourselves have 65,000 hectares, under which the active ones would be about 175 to 200,000 hectares. And we believe that if even 500,000 hectares is brought under cultivation, which is in fullness of time, which may be 8-10 years down the line, probably it might start generating about 1 million tons of additional oil, and by which time India's demand might be closer to 20 million tons. So really from the perspective of self-sufficiency on the oil palm side, I can certainly guarantee that India will be importing maybe 1.5 to 2 times of this edible, the palm oil, from global sources. That's one. The other oil seeds, in terms of enhancing the production, in terms of our capacity to truly sort of scale up and start growing. So 50% growth rate sector is just a wishful thinking. We've tried this for last 3 decades now, right from technology mission on edible TMOP, technology mission on oil seeds, which was launched in late 80s to early 80s, and down to multiple different projects and programs have happened. So what we have recommended to the government is that there are 2 oilseeds which are quite amenable that we can grow. One is mustard and second is sunflower, most efficient converters of oil. So nearly 40% oil yield that you can get. Sunflower, I do believe there's a lot more scope to expand. Mustard also. But largely it's a tough call. So I think broadly palm could maybe additional 1 million tons. You could get an additional 1.5 million tons through mustard and sunflower areas, because problem in Indian agriculture right now, the land is limited. The alternate means of earning revenues for the farmers is way better in a whole lot of crops. For example, horticulture, high value agriculture, which is nearly 75-80% of the GDP, it gives a lot more better returns. So why should farmers go towards growing sunflower and mustard? So that's almost impossible. So this part we'll continue to import. And my last sort of point that I was raising was this issue of consumer concerns. All of us as stakeholders have a serious sort of stake in the ground. I think government from regulatory aspects has taken a lot of policy, but to the poor as farmers and what exactly we are intending to do and how we want to take it forward. I think we'll have to be mindful of the level of sort of economic development. If on that continuum we have to look at the agriculture, if we have to look at the consumers, if we look at the level of awareness and level of sensitivity or the consumer protest around these matters, I think it's still very urban centric sort of phenomenon still. It will grow for sure. So what we need to watch out for a lot more is, of course, we need to be concerned about the environment, but a lot more we need to be concerned about that how in the guise of environment and sustainability and climate change, how the policies might start impacting India. And I think that we need to, if we don't do that, so all the issues what India faces at WTO, all the issues that we face otherwise, so non-tariff barriers of the kind, if they start impacting us in a big way, that India needs to be watchful, and certainly Indian agriculture sector. If we want to be large players to the global markets, I think that is one concern we'll have to be very mindful about.
Great. Thanks a lot for the detailed thoughts on both the situation in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, as well as what's happening in India. Just to summarize what you both have pointed out, I think in terms of production, palm will continue to be dependent on imports. There's not a lot of scope in terms of the other oil seeds. So palm will continue to play a major role in terms of our edible oil needs in the coming decades. Question of profitability is something that we need to think about. I mean, the government policy has devised a scheme, a formula to sort of incentivize the farmers. The pricing mechanism is very clear, so we need to look into that to see how that will continue to be profitable for the farmers. Rain-fed to irrigation, I think that's a fantastic move by the policy. There's incentives to switch to micro irrigation. So there are a lot of good elements to it. And then you also alluded to the regulatory developments that we need to be mindful of, the EU due diligence, which is the hottest topic of debate in the palm sector. Anybody you talk to is worried about how the EU due diligence or deforestation and the sustainable sourcing is going to impact their businesses. So we are doing a study, but we will share more data about how that's going to impact the Indian businesses that have a presence. Similarly, in the US also, there's a Forest Act coming up that's still a draft legislation that's being discussed. So that might also have an impact on some of our businesses that have an exposure to those markets. So that's something to think about. The consumer aspect, I'll come a little later because that's something I wanted to hear your thoughts as well. But so I'll move on to Mr. Jagjeet, who operates in this interesting space of public-private partnerships. So it's a mix of both sectors, and you also have a lot of experience in the private sector. So your thoughts, your initial thoughts on the sustainability on palm, and what do you see as trends, opportunities?
Thanks, Ashwin. Hello. Thanks. So following two stalwarts of the industry, very difficult to give an opinion on the industry, I think, right? So I'll turn it a little different and highlight, I think, what sustainability really means for farmers in India, right? Two very basic concepts, right? Our soils are degraded. That's a basic issue which we've got, and we've got a water problem, right? So to me, when I talk of sustainability or look at sustainability, I want to address those issues, right? Yes, palm oil has this huge, terrible name on deforestation, and as very clearly both have said, that's not a problem in India. So we really need to change our outlook and see what is required for our farmers, right? So I think the first thing when I look at sustainability for palm oil or for edible oils is how do we develop systems which ensure that our soils get better? Because that's the important part for sustainability in the longer term. We are not going to be able to extract more from the soil and then create higher yields from these soils. So I would look at how do you improve that? And ultimately that has to really end up into better incomes for farmers, right? That's the space which we work in. So IDH as a group, as he said, we work in PPP partnerships, what we really do is bring government, businesses, and farmers at one table. And that is what we call a landscape approach. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that because I think that sort of answers some of the issues which are there, right? In the landscape approach, we look at what we call the PPI, which is the production, the protection, and the inclusion. There are three pillars there. So the production is very clearly looking at how do you improve the actual yields of a farmer, how does he get a better value, which is again about soil and water. Protection is how do you look at environment at a bigger scale. So it's about looking not just at one farm, but it's looking at a much larger jurisdiction and beyond farm also. So how do you bring in biodiversity? How do you bring in other elements which would affect him? And climate change is really a big issue there. So the protection aspect that we bring in is on a larger, so maybe look at districts as this thing, or look at watersheds as one piece of unit to when you start developing any policies. And this is where I think governments, and really what we heard today from Mr. K.T. Ramarao is that, they're looking at large projects together, which is about creating not just the farmer, but what affects him externally. Yeah? And inclusion is more about creating a place where everybody gains in the value chain. Yeah? And I think that's something which businesses today in India really do need to look at. Profits are great. That's what businesses are meant for. But you also need to be clear that, profits come from planet and people, right? Basic sustainability, people, planet, and profit. And I always talk of it in the reverse order, which is profit, but profit will not happen if you don't look after the planet, and planet is not going to be looked after if you don't look after the people there, right? So to me, that's inclusion, and in that, and I'm very skeptical. I mean, this is a panel with all male, and there are about, I just counted 8 or 9 ladies in this room, and I think I would really like more inclusion means you bring in more women empowerment to happen. And there are so many studies which talk about saying that when you bring women into supply chains, the results are actually much better. And that's something which we really would like to see more happen, right? And a lot of the work that we do is to ensure that women empowerment and women get a space. And in our agriculture sector, that is one of the biggest problems, right? And that is the fact that women do not hold any land rights, right? They don't really have decision-making in agriculture, whereas they do most of the work on the farms, right? And that's something which I think we need to do. From my point as being a convener of PPP sides, where I would challenge businesses, and this is something which we're working on, RSPO is very much part of it, and I think some of us we're already members on ISPOC together, but I think what we really want to do is how do we create a minimum criteria on sustainability for ourselves, right? Sides. And this is where I think governments need to step in. Asthana ji talked a little bit about policy, but I think we need to be very clear on what is the minimum criteria for imports into the country, and does it address our issues, right? And when we do create something like that, it should also be exactly for our own domestic production, so that we can then stand up to the rest of the world and say that whatever we demand from the outside world, we actually do apply it for ourselves also. Yeah, and to me, the fact that we are the biggest importers of palm oil also gives us a huge amount of power, which as yet I think India is not yet leveraging, right? We should be able to demand from the rest of the world things like deforestation completely, right? And we should be able to demand that social standards from wherever we buy or import palm oil are completely maintained, right? No child labor. Ideally, when we look at it, and the rest of the world has done that to India, all our exports are always ticked box with some standard or something, right? But when we are buying from the rest of the world, and today India is a superpower when it comes to purchasing power, we buy so much, right? We should be able to positively impact SDGs across the world. And I think that's something which India has not yet leveraged, right? If I can say that because of our policies, there is no deforestation in the world, if that there is no child labor across the world, that's a credit which we should be able to take. And I think, to me, that's something which our policymakers definitely should be looking at.
Great, thanks a lot, Jagjeet. You touched upon a few different topics. One is landscape approaches, the minimum import criteria, and more importantly, I think you brought out the message that sustainability is not what we mean echoing, which is it's not just about environmental issues or deforestation, it's much, much beyond. And you addressed one of the elements, which is gender and the empowerment of women in the supply chains, not just on the farms, but also the ones working on the supply chains. And with that comes wages, income, better living and working conditions, a lot of elements. So sustainability is, oftentimes it gets reduced to just one issue. It's looked through a specific lens, because at least for palm, because that is the lens that got the attention. The deforestation is the one, and the orangutans are the ones that have put palm on the agenda. But that's not the only issue in the palm sector, because it's much, much more broader. And that's where I think your point about the landscape approaches comes in, because there are plenty of landscape approaches if you're not familiar with it. I mean, going beyond working with just one particular plantation or one particular farm or one particular management unit, you try to get the entire stakeholders within a certain landscape, which can be an ecological landscape, but it could also be a jurisdiction, a whole state. So together, and then the stakeholders, both of the public and the private sector, come together and first of all make a commitment that anything that's produced in this landscape is going to be sustainable. And what that sustainable, what means, what is that sustainable, how do you define that sustainability for that landscape is totally up to the local stakeholders, because nobody outside is telling you what to do. You as the stakeholders, you have the ability to manage those resources and you make those decisions. This is quite common in many countries, what we've seen in Southeast Asia. Many provinces in Indonesia have made those commitments, the district governors have made those commitments to make sustainable jurisdictions. The state of Sabah, I think we have a representative from MPOC here. So the state of Sabah in Malaysia has also made that commitment to work on sustainability. So both of you alluded to the regulatory thing. So do you think something like, because at least here in India and Telangana and also in Andhra Pradesh, we have a law, we have an act, Oil Palm Act, which governs how the sector is functioning. Do you think a landscape approach is something that we could think about for India in the context of palm, but could be broader than that? It could also be edible oils or any agricultural commodity. Could the state of Telangana, let's say, make a commitment with all the public sectors that everything that's produced in Telangana is going to be sustainable? And then we work out the details of that. Is that something that you think is feasible?
Yeah. Before I come to that, I want to talk about women and policy. I think if women take jobs, take care of issues, they can do it with much more efficiently. We have our illustrious Ms. Bhavna Shah. We are all struggling with each businesses, but she can handle, I think so, the list is very long. India, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, if I left out any countries. So, I think that's very commendable in that direction in terms of how women can add value. I see a lot of women nodding their heads. I encourage you to come into this fantastic agri-business because India is just about agrarian. And coming back to Telangana, I think, yes, Telangana has a huge scope. Every Northeast also has a huge scope. I think the sustainable challenges, like you know already, are slightly different. It's not about deforestation. So there is definitely, it's just a slow burn. It's not that, talking about Indonesia and Malaysia, they've spent ages. I would only say in the sustainability practices or the growth in oilseeds, I think I've studied Vietnam model, climate smart agriculture, Argentinian model, Malaysian and Indonesian. So every country has got a different approach to how you grow. Thailand is a very fantastic example. I think we still need to study how they're growing, because when Indonesia banned the goods, suddenly we realized that Thailand is giving excess of 1.2 million tons suddenly and much more, and they've just emerged as a country. In terms of balancing between oil seeds, policy is very, very important in its entire comprehensiveness, because there are certain oil seeds that there is no import substitutable, that we need to produce ourselves, like mustard, rice bran. India can be an exporter of these products to Asia. Similarly, soybean, of course, all of us, Sanjeev, all of us, Vipin, all of us have seen the crop of 6 million tons growing only 1.11 or 12 million tons over many years. But if it is catching up, if National Mission Oilseeds can grow, then India has got a fantastic chance not only to feed, like this year we don't need meal imports, not only feed the domestic meal industry, but also export to Southeast Asia, substituting Argentinian meal. So, I mean, if you really think longer term, productivity, efficiency, and profitability, if you take care of these three issues, I think there is a huge opportunity. But last but not the least, on the policy front, I just want to say, like today, you got a lot of mustard seed which have been produced in line with Atmanirbharta. But when it comes to MSP, the seeds are operating below MSP. So the government will actually take a decision probably eventually to raise the duties. But then if it is not done timely, you will again get between farmer and consumer. So we as IVPA have been discussing this issue among ourselves. We have Prashant Reddy here, who was along with all our Vipin, Amrendra. We tried to say that, look, the policy between consumer and farmer should be should find its equilibrium balance. And it's very simple for us. We've been at it for last 2-3 years recommending the government like the idea that you link it with the MRP, which is the consumer price in edible oil sector, and link it with the minimum support price, and along with the global prices, you need to predict and preempt what you want to do. That's very much necessary, otherwise what will happen, either the production will grow ahead of time, thereby causing a damage to the revenues, like you know, or it will become a headache for the consumers, especially when I spoke about $3 per day income for 50% of rural dependent consumption. It will become a problem when the edible oil prices become 160. So the balancing all these factors is very, very necessary, even along with sustainability, to take the whole sector up. Thank you.
Great. I think that balancing is what I think a kind of a landscape approach, and it doesn't have to be only on sustainability. It can be broader than that, right? So thinking about the rural economy, the several aspects that you highlighted. To have a more integrated, coherent policy that addresses all of the different elements. It's something that any thoughts on the policy bit?
I'll take a quick one on your specific question to Telangana and generally in agriculture, what can be done. So for example, India has a lot of sort of regulations around all these issues. So for example, banning of digging of bore wells in agriculture. North it is there, I'm not sure about Telangana. It's about the stubble burning. Government did not ban but came out with a lot of different incentive structures and all that. So one challenge which in India is there, that our policy making is all in silos, and different departments or different ministries may have some level of interface or crossover between the policy formation. So it's never efficient. That's one big challenge we have. So we need to have a more integrated orientation towards some of these issues. And I think interministerial, interdepartment, to really sit down and see the implications of all of that. So we can be more efficient in our resource utilization, we can be more efficient in administering this, and our policy formations and regulations can be a lot more efficient. That's the important part. So in palm, for example, there are a lot of good things which are happening. So, for example, the chips of the fresh fruit bunches after done, can be used for making, for the boilers, and it's very efficient. The calorific count is very good. Similarly, the practices at ground level in terms of usage of fertilizers and the micro irrigation, etc., a lot of it can be done. So my simple answer to your question, Ashwin, is that government, in terms of the infra development, incentivizing for the right areas and right behaviors, which are, excuse me, which are both linked to the economic sort of sustainability, for all the stakeholders. Private sector, unfortunately, has very little capability to fund all these areas. So government has to look at infra creation. Government has looked at, the social architecture of how they exactly are going to manage, sort of integrating the various elements. The government is responsible for ensuring that the regulations are sensible, they make sense rather than become an impediment to, the industry or the other stakeholders working. And industry and all the other stakeholders then have to fall in line in terms of working through that. So becomes a major part of it, and government has that ability to do that. So I would say that a lot of it depends on how the policy makers see this, understand the perspectives of different stakeholders, and able to drive things properly on the ground, so that reacts to, and that's a policy role of policy. Policy is nothing but reflecting the ground realities, and which is going to sort of influence actions, and that actions are leading to the intended outcome. That is the role of policy. So I think that is where probably we need to do a lot more. And industry stakeholders will always either fall in line, they'll get together and be able to execute on that. So it's
Jagjeet, any thoughts on what we heard from both of the industry leaders on the coherence of the policy and how it needs to be? Because you also work on not just on palm or edible oil, but several other commodities as an institution and in several geographies. Any experiences that you would like to share?
I think he's put it very, very properly and very simply, saying that our policies are in silos, policy making, right? So, and again, I would come back to the landscape approach. So if the government was to use the landscape approach at policy making time, that would really open out the interdependence between different things within an area, right? And I think Saraj is very nicely put really where that sits. To me, I think, and this food conclave is really a great place to start. The Telangana government, the way they are being proactive, right? And there is a place for all of us really to feed back to them, right? Now, if that doesn't happen, again, silos will happen, right? So if private sector and development people like all of us who are working in this space, if we do not really give feedback to the government at the appropriate time and in a succulent manner, clear manner, then policy would obviously get drafted, which is confusing, and land up with problems. So I think we all have a role to play there, right?
Yeah. Thanks.
Just 30 seconds I'll take. Sure. So the problem in India, I always maintain, is that and all the associations, think tanks, we don't have a rich sort of institutional architecture of think tanks, the people who can research, people who understand the industry issues. You look at any paper in the US, the issues, how they address, the details they get into, they feed into the policy formation, and then they come back to it. In India, if you look at agriculture presentations to Planning Commission, erstwhile Planning Commission, 30 years back, you see them 30 years later, same issues, same national associations, same issues, including in edible oils. I'm just saying, urging IVPA and C and others that when you talk about policy, first you should understand the dimensions of why things are happening. So our problem is our feedback loop into the government, the policy formation, is of actually average to poor in most cases. And there's zero research, there's zero resource allocation, and there's very little work which is going into it. So the government is also struggling as to what inputs to take and how to go about it. So then entire policy is nothing but anecdotal. If my experience is good, I've spoken better, they'll say, aapne acha bola, chalo iska ye theek lag raha hai mere ko. I've been part of planning commission groups, I've chaired the committees. I know how this planning thing, activities happen. And that's a huge problem which India has.
But I would only share my experience with it. I just walked into some government meeting, and there were various departments. We wanted to meet various departments. And concerning some policy. So the topic that came is, how are you going to decide without the data being there? So there is data which is very different from different sectors. And then we started discussing what is the soybean crop size in India. Okay, believe me. And then within about half an hour, with the agriculture ministry and the food and somebody who's in charge of export of meal, somebody who's urging for meal imports to happen, as against somebody who's arguing that no, actually we have enough meal already, so why do we need imports, was the topic. Suddenly it became such a big battlefield in the North Annex. So then I said, it's very impossible to tally the government numbers with the trade numbers, but we have to believe in one God as far as the data is concerned. So you have to follow what some base. Okay, you can say government data plus SOPA data in this question of discussion, that this is the base. And then at least in the next 10 years, 5 years, you will get to the right number. Because you need to tally it from all fronts, exports, production, crushing, and the carry out. Not easy. I'm just talking about one oil seeds. So I think very right that we need to develop that confidence. Government doesn't have trust in the industry numbers. And without numbers, you really can't expect major policy shift. That is very true. Yeah.
Thanks. I think both of you kind of highlighted the role that organizations such as IDH and ourselves could also play in terms of pulling some of the elements in our own areas of expertise when it comes to sustainability or other elements, or pulling together some data and some ideas to put for work with the industry associations to possibly take it to the government. I want to slightly switch gears, and I've been told to end in 1:30, so which is 5 minutes, but I just wanted to slightly switch gears because we've talked about the production side of the story in India, but briefly on the consumer and the market side, just wanted to hear your thoughts. If I can have the slides, so this is just data from a market intelligence a tool that we use called Mintel, which shows a lot of trends that we see in products. So this is like more consumer-facing product launches. And what we've seen, the third arrow, the third graph, I mean, I have a few more slides, but we don't have time to go through that. But just this one I wanted to share. And then what we've seen is an increase in products that have been launched with an ethical or a sustainable claim. So these are end consumer products, be it your refined oil or your soaps or shampoos or biscuits or cookies or whatever. And in terms of in India, what we see is the sweet cookies, potatoes, snacks, and other snacks are some of the products that have the highest. So there are company names here which I have hidden, but some of the highest products that have come out with been launched in the last few years with an ethical claim. I'm not saying it's sustainable, but it's at least we have products going out in the market on ethical claims. And if you combine it with the opportunity that the food industry offers, I mean, this is a graph that, I mean, study done by BCG and FICCI, which shows an enormous potential for the growth in the food processing sector. So today this whole conclave is about the food processing sector and the opportunities. If you combine this, the opportunity that the food processing sector has and the increasing trends we see in product launches and consumers, consumer awareness. So just wanted to put that data out, and then I wanted to hear from our panelists, because both of you industry leaders also are consumer-facing brands, right? So this is India. So this one is India. No, the sweet potatoes packets, that one was India. So we don't have this trend for India. But I think I saw a study by Bain company, which said almost 60% of consumers were willing to pay a premium for ethical sourced products, environmentally responsible products. The focus is still largely on packaging, recycling. That is a priority for the food processing sector at this point, which is understandable. But then the study also said something about ethically sourced products, about 60%. I couldn't find the graph where I was looking for it, but that's something I came across in an India Today article recently. But just as also brands, very popular brands that are consumer facing, what are the strategies, or what are your approaches or to more source, environmentally or ethically responsible products? Are you actively doing something, or do you have a strategy to source? If there's anything that you're doing on that front, if you could share with the audience, that would be inspiring as well.
So, clearly one massive shift which has happened, and I think there's a discussion in another session also, this whole concerns around nutrition, health, sustainability, natural, the fortification. So that's one trend which is driving the world and pretty much India as well. So we are seeing a huge growth which is happening in multiple different areas, right from organic to to healthier sort of products, to the claims that are being made, etc. That's one part. The second is, but this study is not so much about that. It's really about consumers' willingness to pay a premium to products which are either ethically sourced or more sustainable or have got a better claims in terms of how they've been done. If they're more expensive, will they pay for it? I think, Ashwin, my frank answer to that is that we have way to go. So it'll take time where India is concerned. So there is obviously, within the urban pockets, the wealthy consumers, they obviously have their larger issues around health and, or even call it a fad or call it genuine concerns around sustainability. So that clearly is a given. But that in reality for a poor country, for consumers who have to kind of eke out their living with very marginal means, So that is not yet a big issue. I think I come back again that if somehow we were able to not look at the consumers to be willing to pay 30% more or 20% more, but how do we bring down the cost of these products? Why should they be at a large premium? And B, if they are at a premium, that is there a way if we can sort of get the cost of producing them down, which means right from the farm level to supply chains to more efficiency and otherwise. And I think there's a lot of good stuff which is happening in India. So we should not sort of dismiss that. Whether it's the ethanol blending, which is already at 14%, we've advanced from 2030 to 2026, that India will be almost 14%, and they're saying 20% of blending will happen. So there's a lot of good stuff which is going on. The problem is that it's happening in multiple different pockets. It's not getting much spoken about, and it's not fast enough. And I think that is where, if the stakeholders get together, give genuine advice to the government, seems a progressive government here, work along with them, a lot of good stuff can happen. It's possible. You don't have to sell it more expensive to do that.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think you've mentioned very clearly, because oftentimes when we talk about sustainability and demand, we're always thinking about, okay, is there a consumer demand? So we are expecting the consumers to ask for these kind of products, and it's not, and as you rightly said, it's not necessarily going to happen in a country like India, where we're thinking about edible oils from a more food security point of view. So just one question, follow-up question, and maybe for all three of you, which to reflect also on your closing thoughts, because we need to wrap up. In the absence of any drivers for sustainability in terms of consumer demand, we've touched upon policy. Are there any other drivers that you see to mainstream sustainability? Is there a role for different players, financial sector or other actors? Or are we looking at regulations? What are your closing thoughts and any drivers that you see to probably mainstream sustainability in India? Maybe I'll start with Mr. Sudhakar and then...
I just recall some country where 100% it is sustainable at zero cost. You look at the soybean cultivation in US, they promise 100% sustainability, but no extra cost, zero cost. So eventually, I think we need to go to be mindful of the cost versus sustainability, because India is developing. Indian demand is very sensitive to price. It's not very easy, and not only about palm oil. And second point is that, yes, India is a very large importer of palm oil. We should be really dictating. We should be really dictating to the terms of sustainability. Theoretically, yes, but practically, we are unable to change one Dobby value in the import of palm oil. That's reality on the ground, okay? But as far as the sustainability part is concerned, we are more a destination market. All we can say is that we want to avoid buying from somebody who is not having a sustainable practices. Like, for example, there is a consumer demand which is going, I think, I can put a number, 300,000, 400,000 tons. Probably palm is growing in terms of RSPO certification. There are other sustainable practices. We are trying to figure out and enlarge the scope of it. At least in IVPA, we have taken up sustainability as definitely as a forum, more education, more interaction. We have an MOU with MPOCC. We have an MOU with, we are honored to have an MOU with RSPO to spread more and more education about sustainability. The practical framework of consumers will pay eventually. But then, are they paying how much for what purpose? So it's a gradual pace. More and more, I think, should come from the origins in case of palm oil and on the other oilseeds that we produce. There is a lot more to be done to make Indian agriculture, the other oilseeds also sustainable, that we discussed, and probably we are having one more panel discussion on this topic of oil seeds and its related complexities. So everybody after lunch would be still here in this room, I guess, because that's what we're going to take it of. Thank you.
Thanks. The cost versus sustainability, I think it's an important element, and yeah, so that's something that we need. It should never be expensive to do the right thing, but unfortunately that is the reality, and we need to turn it around. So any closing thoughts? And
just a quick one. I think we need to have a narrative, and it requires a lot of consumer education. Is not an easy affair. I think if to mainstream that, to bring centrality to that theme, I think is a role which RSPO and IDH and a lot of institutions can play. Large companies should play that role as well to pass on the message. Schools have a great message. I mean, you go to today's schools, my daughters went to Sri Ram, and the kind of messaging what they have in terms of less water usage and less this one is fabulous. So I think that's what it takes time. This is not an overnight thing. I think it's a continuum over which we'll work, but it'll come, but in its own time.
Thanks. Any closing thoughts, Jagjeet? Because you kind of, if you read between the lines of what Sudhakar ji was saying earlier, the minimum import standards is what I heard him saying as a potential tool moving forward.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree there. But I would say, and this is for businesses, for producers, don't do sustainability for somebody else. Don't do it for the consumer. Do it for yourself, right? At the producer level, sustainability, like I said, is for the farmer to do it because he has to improve his soils, his water. That's what will help him. For businesses, sustainability is about making sure that there is value distribution through the chain, because if you don't give value down to the producer, he'll stop producing that and he'll jump to something else. So your business sustainability will be at risk. So do sustainability for yourselves. Consumers really don't understand sustainability. If you talk to 10 guys, one chap will say child labor, one chap will say soil, one will say water. And you can't address everything and can't take that message to a consumer like that. So if you try and do it for the consumer, you're asking for trouble. So I would really look at the point of saying, why do you want to do sustainability? And then be able to clearly define what sustainability means to you. And that's where I agree. Minimum criterias, so there has to be some common goals which all of us can then jump onto, right? Which is easier then to also create that narrative, create that talk about what do we mean by it.
No, very rightly said.
One more line.
Sure.
And sustainability is a moving target. Yeah? That's something which we must also recognize. What is the demand today on sustainability will change tomorrow, right? So let's not get stuck on that part too.
Yeah. It is not a steady state, and oftentimes we say, oh, we are fully sustainable. But sustainability is a journey, and that is reflective in every initiative that we see. It's constant evolution, new issues come up, and then you keep discovering new issues, and you keep evolving and adapting. So I think we got the signal that we have to wrap up. So thanks a lot. It was a bit rushed, but hope this was some good food for thought for everybody in the room. There's also a lot of expertise in the room, and we look forward to hear a lot more of you later in the day. And thanks a lot for your participation, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to all our panelists as well.